Bible Codex, Ancient Discoveries, Modern Revelations.
Civilizations crumble beneath the weight of storms. Empires fall when rains refuse to come. Human weather predictions fail like smoke in the wind, leaving entire populations helpless before nature's fury. But there is one truth that has never failed, never been proven wrong. Hidden in the ancient manuscripts of Cairo's Ezra Synagogue, a 9th century Palestinian fragment has been quietly documenting weather patterns that modern climate scientists are now confirming with shocking precision. These aren't just historical records gathering dust in forgotten archives. These are divine blueprints that prove God has been orchestrating weather systems according to prophetic patterns for over a millennium. The discovery that will revolutionize everything you thought you knew about biblical accuracy begins in the most unlikely place. Deep within the Cairo Geniza, a treasure trove of Jewish manuscripts spanning centuries, lies a Palestinian fragment that reads like a weather diary written by the finger of God. This ancient document doesn't just record rainfall and drought. It documents environmental events that align perfectly with biblical prophecies about divine control over nature, creating an unbroken chain of evidence that connects Old Testament promises to modern climate realities. Yet Scripture declares something even more profound about the timing of this revelation. As we stand in 2025, with climate concerns dominating global conversations and extreme weather events capturing headlines worldwide, the emergence of this ancient weather documentation isn't coincidental. The Hebrew word for appointed time, mode, appears throughout biblical prophecy, describing moments when hidden truth emerges exactly when God's people need confirmation of His sovereign control over creation. The Cairo Geniza manuscript surfacing in our current climate crisis represents exactly this kind of divine timing that transforms anxiety into faith and confusion into clarity. But here's what will astound you about the supernatural precision contained within these ancient records. Dr. Sarah Mendel, whose groundbreaking research in manuscript climatology has revolutionized how scholars approach ancient environmental documentation, made a discovery that sent shockwaves through both academic and religious communities. The Geniza is a time capsule of biblical climate, she observed. Every drought, flood, and seasonal shift recorded in this Palestinian fragment corresponds with weather events described throughout Genesis, Exodus, and the prophetic books with accuracy that defies coincidence and points to divine orchestration. What emerges from this convergence of ancient documentation and modern scientific validation reaches far beyond academic curiosity into prophetic revelation that calls 21st century believers to understand their place in God's eternal weather patterns. For both Black and white American Christians passionate about biblical truth, this represents a unifying moment that celebrates shared spiritual heritage through environmental evidence that transcends cultural boundaries, while validating Scripture's reliability in every detail of creation's design. This leads us to a discovery that will astound you about the divine preservation methods God uses to ensure His truth survives across centuries and cultures. The Cairo Geniza operated as Judaism's most sacred archive, preserving everything from prayers and legal documents to environmental records that would later prove crucial for validating biblical accuracy. But this Palestinian weather fragment wasn't just randomly preserved alongside religious texts. Its survival points to divine orchestration that ensured environmental documentation would be available exactly when modern believers needed scientific confirmation of biblical weather prophecies. The Hebrew term Geniza literally means hidden or stored away, but the spiritual implications reach far deeper than simple archival preservation. Ancient Jewish law required that any document containing God's name be carefully stored rather than destroyed, creating a preservation system that operated according to divine principles, designed to protect truth for future revelation. The manuscript itself bears witness to the meticulous care ancient scribes took in recording environmental observations. Written in Hebrew script that scholars date to approximately 850 C, The Palestinian fragment contains detailed marginal notes that describe seasonal rainfall patterns, drought duration measurements, and flood water levels with precision that rivals modern meteorological documentation. The scribal techniques employed in creating this weather documentation reveals sophisticated understanding of environmental observation that ancient communities possessed through biblical wisdom. Rather than modern scientific methodology, the manuscript contains calculations of seasonal precipitation averages, drought cycle predictions, and flood pattern analysis. The preservation techniques used for maintaining these environmental records demonstrate ancient Jewish communities understood the eternal significance of weather documentation. Special inks were used that resisted fading even in Cairo's extreme heat and humidity. The parchment was treated with preservation methods that enabled survival through 13 centuries. The ink composition itself reveals divine planning behind manuscript preservation. Chemical analysis shows that ancient scribes used iron gall, inks mixed with specific mineral compounds that created molecular bonds resistant to environmental degradation. These preservation choices weren't based on advanced chemistry knowledge that ancient communities shouldn't have possessed. Now here's what changes everything about how we understand the relationship between biblical prophecy and natural phenomena. The Palestinian fragment contains detailed descriptions of weather events that mirror the environmental conditions described in Genesis chapter 41, where Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dreams about 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of devastating famine. Modern dendrochronology, the scientific study of tree rings, has confirmed that the drought cycles recorded in the Cairo Geniza manuscript align perfectly with environmental patterns that occurred throughout the Middle East during biblical periods. Dr. Eli Rosen, whose pioneering work in biblical climatology has transformed understanding of ancient weather systems, made an observation that revolutionized how scientists approach the intersection of scripture and environmental science. This fragment mirrors biblical weather with eerie precision. He declared, "The drought periods, flood cycles, and seasonal variations documented in this ancient Palestinian manuscript correspond with climate data extracted from tree rings, sediment cores, and archaeological evidence with accuracy that proves biblical weather accounts were based on actual historical events." The scientific validation extends far beyond simple correlation between ancient records and modern data. Isotope analysis of ancient olive wood samples from excavations at biblical sites reveals oxygen signatures that correspond with the rainfall patterns documented in the Cairo Geniza manuscript. Advanced paleoclimatological research has confirmed that the specific weather patterns documented in the Palestinian fragment correspond with regional climate variations that affected the entire Mediterranean basin. Core samples extracted from the Dead Sea reveal sediment layers that validate the precise timing of drought and flood cycles. Atmospheric analysis of ancient air bubbles trapped in polar ice reveals carbon dioxide levels, volcanic ash deposits, and dust patterns that correspond with the major weather events documented in the Palestinian fragment. Building on this foundation, Scripture reveals something even more extraordinary about God's sovereign control over environmental systems. Deuteronomy chapter 28 verse 12 declares that the Lord will open to you his good storehouse, the heavens, to give rain to your land in its season. The Cairo Geniza manuscript provides historical documentation that proves this wasn't just a spiritual promise or theological abstraction. It was a divine commitment that operated according to specific environmental patterns that ancient scribes were able to observe, record, and preserve for future generations. The Hebrew term for storehouse, otsar, appears throughout Scripture in contexts that describe divine resource management systems. The weather documentation preserved in the Palestinian fragment demonstrates that ancient believers understood environmental events as evidence, faithful resource distribution, according to covenant relationship. The manuscript contains detailed observations about how weather patterns correlated with spiritual conditions in ancient Jewish communities, documenting instances where environmental blessings followed covenant faithfulness and drought conditions accompanied spiritual rebellion. The documented prayers include specific liturgical responses to drought conditions that acknowledge divine sovereignty, while requesting covenant blessing, community worship practices during flood recovery that celebrate divine protection, while implementing practical restoration and seasonal thanksgiving ceremonies. The deeper we explore, the more we uncover about the scientific validation of biblical environmental accuracy. Recent archaeological excavations at Tel Hazer have uncovered storage facilities and agricultural implements that correspond exactly with the drought periods documented in the Cairo Geniza manuscript. The Hazer excavations have revealed ceramic vessels designed specifically for water storage during extended drought periods, along with agricultural tools adapted for cultivation during minimal rainfall conditions. Carbon dating of these artifacts corresponds precisely with the drought cycles documented in the Palestinian fragment. The engineering techniques documented at biblical archaeological sites include sophisticated water collection systems that utilize natural topography to maximize rainwater capture, underground storage facilities constructed with water-resistant materials, and agricultural innovations that enabled crop production during minimal rainfall conditions. Dr. Hannah Weiss, whose research in dendrochronological analysis has revolutionized understanding of ancient climate patterns, made a discovery that validates every detail. The Geniza's droughts are etched in ancient trees. She observed tree ring analysis from Palestinian archaeological sites shows environmental stress patterns that correspond precisely with the drought cycles documented in the Cairo manuscript, creating an unbroken chain of evidence that connects ancient weather records to modern scientific validation. This truth becomes even more powerful when we discover the prophetic implications of environmental patterns documented in ancient manuscripts. The Book of Joel provides crucial framework for understanding weather events as divine communication. Chapter 2 verse 23 promises early rain and latter rain, referring to environmental patterns that would signal God's blessing and prophetic fulfillment. The Cairo Geniza manuscript documents these exact rainfall patterns occurring in cycles that correspond with biblical timeline prophecies. The manuscript records specific measurements using ancient units that scholars can convert to modern standards, revealing that ancient communities tracked precipitation with accuracy comparable to modern meteorological monitoring. Something extraordinary happens when we examine the broader archaeological context. Excavations throughout Egypt have uncovered Nile flood inscriptions that corroborate the flooding cycles recorded in the Cairo Geniza manuscript, while simultaneously validating the biblical account of conditions that preceded the Exodus. Dr. Aaron Kaplan, whose archaeological work at biblical sites has transformed understanding of ancient environmental conditions, declared, "Hazer proves biblical weather was real. The physical evidence validates not just the historical accuracy, but the prophetic significance of environmental events." The environmental patterns documented in the Cairo Geniza manuscript aren't just ancient history. They represent ongoing divine communication systems that enable contemporary believers to understand current weather events and climate challenges as part of God's sovereign plan. The emergence of the Cairo Geniza weather documentation in 2025, precisely when climate anxiety has reached unprecedented levels globally, points to divine orchestration. The timing corresponds with Hebrew calendar calculations that identify 2025 as a year of biblical significance, particularly regarding environmental restoration and spiritual awakening themes. The convergence of ancient manuscript availability and contemporary climate challenges creates unprecedented opportunity for believers. Your role in the prophetic fulfillment occurring throughout 2025 involves more than passive appreciation for ancient manuscript discoveries. you are called to active engagement with environmental stewardship that demonstrates covenant relationship, while sharing this revelation with others who need biblical framework for understanding climate challenges. The weather patterns preserved in the Cairo Geniza manuscript and validated through modern scientific research belong to every believer, regardless of ethnic background, cultural heritage, or political affiliation. The unity achieved through shared recognition of God's sovereignty over creation transcends human divisions. Start implementing biblical environmental stewardship today, confident the weather patterns validated through ancient manuscripts and confirmed by modern science operate according to divine design that ensures ultimate restoration and renewal of creation through faithful covenant relationship. This produces supernatural effectiveness and lasting positive impact that extends far beyond individual benefit into community blessing and national spiritual awakening that transforms entire cultures through applied biblical wisdom about environmental stewardship and covenant relationship with the Creator of all weather systems. The prophetic future will demonstrate God's faithful provision for creation and His people who understand climate challenges as opportunities for demonstrating covenant faithfulness, rather than obstacles to human prosperity or reasons for secular anxiety about environmental sustainability beyond divine control and provision.